What would you do if, for one day, you could become invisible and see how people really treat you? What if you discovered that the respect you expect depends more on appearances than on who you really are? That's exactly what Ethan Caldwell, CEO of one of the country's largest airlines, decided to try, but he could never have imagined what he was about to face. At age 46, Ethan had transformed SkyVista Airlines into an aviation powerhouse, investing years of effort into elevating the company to the industry's elite. But something had been bothering him. Persistent criticisms about customer service, with reports of passengers complaining of favoritism and rude behavior by staff. He knew that no internal report or boardroom presentation would bring him the truth he needed. He had to see it with his own eyes. It was then that the idea came up. He would disguise himself without privileges or luxury and fly like any ordinary passenger. With no security guards, no assistants, and using the name of a stranger, Ethan wanted to feel firsthand what it meant to be treated as just another one. It wasn't just about policy or services. It was personal. He wanted to understand how people were really treated when no one knew who he was. The next morning at 6 a.m., Ethan arrived at Los Angeles International Airport. Wearing a simple black t-shirt and worn jeans, he looked indistinguishable from any other hurried traveler. An old backpack slung over his shoulder was all he carried. As he walked through the terminal, he felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Could he infiltrate without being recognized? And most importantly, would it find out whether the complaints were founded or were they just isolated cases? The airport was as busy as ever, with the sound of suitcase wheels echoing on the tiled floor and announcements muffled over the sound system. Ethan got in line at the self-service kiosk to print his ticket. He had a simple plan: watch, listen, and feel everything like an ordinary passenger, but what he didn't expect was how quickly things would start to spiral out of control. Gerald Bennett walked to the self-service terminal, something he hadn't done in years. He inserted his credit card, picked up his boarding pass, and looked at his assigned seat, 2A, first class. Perfect. He slipped the card into his pocket, grabbed his old travel bag, and headed toward the security checkpoint, feeling a mix of nostalgia and curiosity. At TSA control, Gerald carefully observed what was happening around him. An imposing man, dressed in an expensive suit and a designer suitcase, walked through the line without being questioned. Shortly afterwards, a mother with 2 young children was stopped and had to disassemble all of her luggage for inspection. Gerald frowned, trying to ignore the discrepancy. He wondered if this was a pattern or just coincidence. When it was his turn, Gerald went through the X-ray without any problems, but he couldn't get the woman's expression out of his mind as she struggled to balance the baby on her lap while organizing her belongings. Still, he remembered the purpose of his mission: to observe and learn without making hasty judgments. Arriving at Gate 37A, Gerald found an empty place to sit and observed the movement around. The gate was full of energy. There were tired families, professionals focused on their laptops, and teenagers laughing loudly as they talked about their vacations. Gerald watched silently, noticing subtle patterns in the interactions. He saw a middle-aged couple asking about a seat upgrade. The gate agent greeted them with a warm smile and checked their details patiently. Minutes later, an elderly man approached with a similar question and was addressed briefly and harshly. Gerald's stomach turned slightly, but he decided not to jump to conclusions. When boarding was announced, Gerald took his ticket and joined the first-class line. The gate agent, a young woman with a practiced smile, looked at him and immediately stopped him before he handed over the ticket. "Sir, this line is for first-class passengers only," she said in a firm but restrained tone. Gerald maintained his composure and handed over the note with a calm smile. "Yes, it's me." The agent examined the note and then looked at it with a doubtful expression. She took a few seconds longer than necessary before scanning the note. "Just a moment," he murmured, before walking away to make a call. As he waited, Gerald felt the gazes of the other passengers gathering on his back. He heard discreet murmurs, but clear enough to hear the tone of suspicion. What did he do? Did he try to game the system? Why are they holding him? The agent returned with a more neutral expression. "We'll need to verify some information safely," she said, gesturing for Gerald to step out of line. Gerald stepped aside, remaining calm, but feeling a surge of frustration. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" he asked, trying to sound unconcerned. The agent did not respond directly and instead called for the next passenger. The man behind Gerald, wearing an impeccable suit, was greeted with a friendly smile and allowed to board immediately. Gerald took a deep breath, remembering that this moment was part of his mission. He wanted to see how he would be treated as a regular passenger, and he knew that was exactly what was happening. A few minutes later, a security officer arrived at the gate. His presence caused the tension in the room to visibly increase. "What's the matter here?" asked the agent, alternating his gaze between Gerald and the gate agent. "I need to check this passenger's ticket and identification," the agent replied, keeping her tone firm, but showing signs of hesitation. "Something doesn't feel right." "Doesn't that feel right?" Gerald responded calmly but firmly. "I already showed my ticket. What exactly is wrong?" The security officer intervened. "Sir, I need to see your identification," he said. Gerald handed over his driver's license without protest. The agent examined the document, alternating glances between the document and Gerald before returning it. "Everything seems in order," concluded the agent, handing the identification back to Gerald. "Even so," the gate agent insisted, "I still think we should confirm this with management." As the minutes dragged on, Gerald noticed that some passengers took out their cell phones and began to discreetly record the interaction. He pretended not to notice, maintaining his calm and professional demeanor. Finally, a supervisor arrived holding a tablet. He reviewed Gerald's documents and quickly typed something. After a few moments, he looked at the agent and said, "No problem at all. He's a legitimate first-class passenger." The agent hesitated for another moment before returning the note to Gerald. He took the document and headed to boarding, feeling the weight of stares as he passed through the line. When Gerald finally settled into his first-class seat, he let out a discreet sigh. The experience had been eye-opening, but also uncomfortable. He knew this was just the first part of what he planned to observe during this trip. As the plane taxied down the runway, Gerald looked around, taking in the passengers and crew. He paid attention to every detail, from the smiles offered to passengers to the subtlest gestures that indicated how people were really treated. He was determined to see the end of his mission and understand what happened when no one knew who he really was. What he didn't know was that the events of that trip were about to reveal truths he could never have imagined about the company he led, about the people around him, and most importantly, about himself. Gerald adjusted his seatbelt and rested his head on the back of the seat as the plane prepared to take off. He discreetly observed the passengers around him, trying to understand the subtleties of their interactions. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, handing out hot towels to first-class passengers. His smile seemed automatic, more a training reflex than a genuine gesture. When the flight attendant arrived at his row, Gerald noticed a slight hesitation before he was served. The towel was delivered quickly, without the same enthusiasm that he had noticed in previous appointments. It wasn't obvious, but Gerald had a trained eye for detail and began to put together a mental picture of the experience that many passengers must face in silence. The takeoff was smooth, and the on-board service soon began. Gerald watched as the flight attendant passed by with the drinks cart, interacting with passengers in a courteous manner, but without the energy he knew Stellar Wings promoted in their training. He wondered how he would be treated if they knew who he was. When the flight attendant reached him, Gerald asked for a glass of water and coffee. The flight attendant nodded, but returned minutes later with just the water. Gerald thanked him, but wondered if the omission of coffee was on purpose or a simple mistake. Decided not to mention it. This was a test, after all, and he wanted to see how far the difference in treatment could go. While taking small sips of water, Gerald watched a passenger in the front row gesture impatiently to the same flight attendant. He demanded that his request be fulfilled immediately and spoke in a raised tone of voice. To Gerald's surprise, the flight attendant attended to the man promptly, with an even more forced smile, trying to diffuse the tension. This is how they react when the pressure builds, Gerald thought, feeling a mixture of empathy and frustration. The flight continued normally, but Gerald noticed nuances that painted a disconcerting portrait. Better-dressed passengers received more attention. People with more authoritative tones of voice were served more quickly, while those who were calmer and more humble, like a simple-looking man sitting next to him, seemed to be ignored for long periods. Shortly afterwards, lunch was served. Gerald accepted the meal with a polite smile, observing the presentation of the dish and mentally comparing it with the promises made at the company's board meetings. He knew that Stellar Wings prided itself on offering superior quality, but at that moment, the dish seemed average and not up to the high standards he believed it was delivering to customers. The woman sitting in the seat next to Gerald looked nervous. She was a young woman traveling alone, clearly unaccustomed to flying first class. She hesitated before calling the flight attendant for help with the non-working entertainment tablet. "Sorry to bother you," she began, her voice almost trailing off. The flight attendant replied in a hurried tone, "I will check it when I have time." Time passed and no one came back to help. Gerald watched, his frustration growing. He knew that the basics of in-flight service were making passengers feel comfortable, no matter who they were. He decided to intervene, leaning slightly towards the young woman and offering help. Together, they discovered that the tablet had a dead battery. "Thank you," said the young woman, visibly relieved. "I didn't want to bother anyone else." Gerald just smiled, but the interaction stayed in his mind. How many people felt like her, reluctant to ask for assistance because they didn't want to be a burden? The rest of the flight was uneventful, but Gerald couldn't shake the feeling that there was something fundamentally wrong with the service Stellar Wings offered. The quality was there in parts, the seats were comfortable, the space was ample, but the humane treatment seemed to have gotten lost along the way. When the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, Gerald made a point of observing the expressions and interactions around him. He saw genuine smiles on some faces, but also quiet frustration on others. There was a clear discrepancy between the experiences of different types of passengers. Upon exiting the plane, Gerald thanked the flight staff with a polite smile, receiving lukewarm responses. He knew the test was far from over. This was just one part of the journey, and he was determined to deepen his analysis. At the arrivals terminal, Gerald picked up his carry-on luggage and walked slowly to the exit. As he walked through the lobby, he heard a conversation between two passengers who had been on the same flight. "Did you see how that flight attendant practically ignored the woman who asked for help?" asked one of them. "Yeah, but he was all smiles for that other guy," replied the other. "It's always like that. If you don't look important, they treat you like you're invisible." The words echoed in Gerald's mind as he got into a taxi. He knew he needed to act. This trip had already revealed much more than he expected, but it had also made it clear that there was still much to be understood and corrected. As the taxi took him to the hotel, Gerald began making notes in a notebook he had brought. He detailed every observation, every interaction, every failure he had witnessed. This wasn't just a list of problems, it was the start of an action plan. Gerald knew that as CEO, he had the power to implement change. But more than that, he felt a responsibility to ensure that Stellar Wings became a company that treated all of its passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of who they were or where they came from. What he had witnessed was more than simple customer service errors. It was a reflection of how people behaved when they believed they were not being watched. And that was something Gerald was determined to change, starting with the example he would set as a leader. Gerald's mission had become something bigger than he initially planned. He wasn't just investigating his company's failings, he was facing a reality that challenged him to be better, to demand more from himself and his team. He knew the real test began now. Gerald Bennett remained calm as he looked at the gate agent, his words filled with a firmness that came from experience. I know situations like this can be complicated, and I know this isn't just about you. Bias isn't always intentional, but the impact it has is very real. The environment seemed to hold its breath. Passengers, employees, and even the security agent, who remained silent at the side, seemed to absorb every word. Gerald turned to the group of people who had witnessed the entire interaction. For those who saw what happened today, I hope you take this as something to reflect on. Each of us deserves respect, no matter what we look like, where we come from, or how much money we have. A woman in the crowd finally broke the silence. "You handled it amazingly," she said, her voice firm and clear. Most would have lost control. In that situation, Gerald smiled. "I'm not going to lie, I was frustrated, but anger doesn't solve anything. It only creates barriers." Moments like these, as uncomfortable as they are the ones that can actually bring about real change. The security officer stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his voice lower, "I would like to apologize in person. It was not my intention to escalate the situation like this." Gerald nodded, his tone remaining controlled but warm. "I appreciate it, and I hope this moment causes us all to think twice about how we treat people in the future." Finally, boarding resumed. This time, Gerald was invited to pass with smiles from staff and looks of solidarity from some passengers. The tension that once hung in the air seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a sense of understanding. When Gerald sat back down in his first-class seat, he noticed something different. The atmosphere on the plane had changed. The conversations were quieter, but loaded with meaning. He could see looks being exchanged between the passengers who had witnessed the situation at the gate. As some settled down, a young man approached Gerald with a shy smile. "Thanks for what you said back there," he muttered as he stowed his suitcase in the overhead compartment. "I've been through things like this, but never had the courage to speak up. It was inspiring to see how you handled it." Gerald nodded, offering a smile. "Sometimes talking is the only way to move forward," he said simply but with conviction. As the plane gained altitude, Gerald replayed the events in his mind. He knew he hadn't planned on causing a scene, but when the moment came, there was no ignoring what was happening. It was more than an isolated interaction with the gate agent. It was a reflection of something bigger, a culture, a system, a set of behaviors that needed to be addressed. When the flight arrived at its destination, Gerald disembarked as calmly as he had boarded, but feeling the weight of what he had learned. As he passed through the airport lobby, he heard bits of conversation. People commented on what had happened, some in a tone of indignation, others admiring the stance he had maintained. Social media was already full of reports. Passengers who had witnessed the incident began posting videos and messages. One tweet in particular went viral. "Today, the CEO of Stellar Wings taught a lesson in humanity and leadership by standing up to prejudice head-on. We need more role models like him." Back at the office, Gerald called a meeting with his executive team. When everyone was gathered together, he began to describe his experience. He spared no details, talking about the discomfort he felt, the subtle differences in passenger treatment, and how it all reflected deeper problems in Stellar Wings culture. "If we want to be a company that truly stands for excellence," said Gerald, looking at each of his executives, "we need to start from within. It's not enough to have the best planes or the best seats. We need to ensure that every passenger, no matter who they are, be treated with respect and dignity." The room fell, silent. Some executives nodded slowly, while others remained thoughtful, but the impact of Gerald's words was palpable. He knew changes wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to start immediately. The first measures were implemented quickly. Stellar Wings has introduced a mandatory training program for all employees, focusing on unconscious bias and empathy in service. Additionally, they created a direct channel for passengers to report their experiences, ensuring that no complaints were ignored. Meanwhile, Gerald's story continued to spread. The media embraced the incident as an example of modern, responsible leadership. He was invited to participate in panels and discussions about corporate culture and inclusion, but his priority remained focused on Stellar Wings. 7 months later, Gerald received an unexpected letter. It was from the gate agent. The letter was handwritten, its words simple but full of emotion. "Mr. Bennett," the letter began, "since that day I have thought a lot about what happened. Your patience and your words have taught me more than any training I have ever received. I am working to be better, and I hope you know the impact you had in me. Thank you for showing me that change is possible." Gerald held the letter for a moment, reflecting. He didn't see it as a plea for forgiveness, but as a reminder that every interaction, no matter how small, can leave a lasting mark. The trip he had taken, initially planned as a low-key mission to evaluate his company, ended up turning into something much bigger. It wasn't just about Stellar Wings or the flaws in the system. It was about what it meant to be human, to be a leader, and to recognize that everyone deserves dignity and respect. In the following months, Stellar Wings continued to expand its initiatives. Diversity programs were introduced, and the company began sharing its passengers' stories as a way to inspire change within and outside the organization. Gerald knew the work would never be completed, but that didn't discourage him. On the contrary, it motivated him to continue. On his desk, Gerald kept the letter from the gate agent in a drawer, a constant reminder that every decision, every word, and every action has the power to transform lives. If you believe leaders should inspire real change, subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how small actions can transform lives and create a positive impact.